Okay, thank you. That is very kind of Chao Jiao. Thank you for the introduction or for attending. I should say I was actually an oceanographer in training in marine geochemistry at Le Mans, and then later I moved on land and worked primarily in groundwater systems, but also in a little bit in rivers and lakes. So I received a very substantial National Science Foundation of China grant starting only this year to look on working coastal systems, but from a land and ocean continuum perspective. So hopefully you won't be too disappointed because I think we're still very far away from being able to forecast harmful algal bloom. So hopefully today's presentation will bring more questions and answers. But I think it's really wonderful that you have the OEFI initiative, and I think much more work needs to take place. So, we might not be able to advance. Okay, here we go. My talk, this is the outline. It's a little bit unconventional. To the left is the watershed, highlight the Pearl River estuary area, which is where most of the work is currently taking place or will take place. And I will just start with the part one is this very simple request by the mayor of Shenzhen. Sorry, I should go back. So Hong Kong is right here. It's mostly that island, and then the adjacent mainland part is its new territory. And the city of Shenzhen, which has 20 million people, is immediately north of that. So that's where SASTEC is. And we share a lot of coastal water. And last year, the mayor of Shenzhen went to visit all the coastal areas of he's a new mayor, and he declared that he wanted to have the dissolved oxygen concentration to meet the class 1 standard of greater than 6 milligram per liter all year round. That's a very high, very tall calling, and because this is the class 1 in China, in coastal environment and freshwater environment, they tend to different, like first class, second class, third class water quality standards. And, but for dissolved oxygen, we know typically hypoxia is defined as greater than 3. And you can see the oxygen solubility in water at various temperatures, and for coastal water in Shenzhen subtropical, this is kind of getting close to saturation. So he thought his request was simple, but it's very challenging. So now I'm showing you this map from Liu et al., who is a paper by a student, my colleague, Jimmy Zhao at Hong Kong University. He's done a lot of work around the Hong Kong, where this particular paper talks about alkalinity balance and CO2 fluxes. But I want to draw your attention to, so basically Shenzhen water is this Pearl River estuary and goes to the deep bay, which we also call Shenzhen Bay. Hong Kong and Shenzhen shares half. And because of this big estuary, Pearl River, and on the western side of these embayments has short residence time. But if you move to the east, the first one is Mears Bay, or we call Dapeng Bay. The residence time is much longer. And here you can already notice in towards the eastern side of the bay, there's a pier, drawdown of CO2 going into the bay, suggesting the photosynthesis in this particular embayment is by and large greater than respiration. So, to address the mayor's point, we have a small contract from the city. We started to look at historical data. It turns out there's very little marine water environmental monitoring up until 2021. So this is really just they started to collect regularly surface water and bottom water oxygen every season, basically one cruise in a season. So we looked at that data. We can see the bottom water indeed close to this area where there is a big wastewater treatment plant going into the river. So around this area, the bottom water has the lowest oxygen captured by cruise going out primarily in August. So it's going to be really tough to have more than 6 milligram per liter dissolved oxygen even in this part of the area, when generally speaking, much better water quality than in the Powell River estuary. So we started to look into, so we have a grant from the city. We begin to look at this in the summer. In 2023, we did a lot of sampling. These are the daily precipitation and in blue, as well as the temperature. And if you just also, when we looked at remote sensing, reconstructed sort of the extent of the algal bloom, there was a bloom noticeable in this area, in this little embayment, but also in a lot of Hong Kong water on June 10th. And you can see it's after quite a few days of rain, and also it's warm. And this repeats on June the 26th, much more extensive algal bloom extent. And then also on July the 8th. And by that time, there were drones flying out to look at this water. We were able to see this pretty red tide on July the 8th. So definitely in this area, we are experiencing algal bloom. And now I turn to the work that was led by Professor Gan's group at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. His student Dou Li has written several really nice papers, but this just illustrates sort of like the mean summer condition that's illustrated about bottom water distribution in this model domain that includes the Powell River estuary and the Shelf Sea. And you can see this two big blob of very low oxygen bottom water just off the coast of the Powell River of Hong Kong. And then this is the surface water dissolved oxygen. You can see because so much pollution essentially coming down from the Powell River, even the surface water has very low dissolved oxygen. And then this is a chlorophyll from the summertime, big, you would say, bloom. A little bit offshore, further offshore than the oxygen. So Li et al. Paper argue there's onshore transport of the dead plankton mass from this bloom, and then making the closer to shore bottom water anoxic. And then, of course, you see this huge input of dissolved nitrate coming from the land, as well as particulate organic nitrogen coming from the land. And bear in mind, this whole watershed drains a substantial amount of southern China, and this really, in the last 20 years, since 2000, has seen enormous growth, economic growth, and therefore inputs of nitrogenous phosphorus. So if we take a closer look of the, extent of algal bloom, this is if there is a observation. So this is from MODIS satellite remote sensing. It was work done by my colleague, Lian Feng, and his student. So basically, they worked out a way to correct optically some of this remote sensing signal to allow them to tease out better the influence of the huge amount of suspended particle, so we can count whether there is a bloom event or not each day. So you can see in July and August, there is up to about 10-ish days with quite high chlorophyll concentrations in Hong Kong coast water. But if you look at the monitoring, Hong Kong environmental monitoring, they have these stations, these dots, and you can see sometimes, mostly remote sensing, overestimate. So, or you could say the monitoring, because they're sparse, they underestimate the number of blooms in this region. So there's clearly discrepancy between how we monitor and track these events, and come back to that. This is one of the great challenges. And also another characteristics of algal bloom in this area, it's in the last 25 years-ish, every 6 or 7 years, the dominant bloom species has changed. So now it's really complex mixture of different species in these coast waters. So if you look at this whole area, the bloom count, this shouldn't be annual mean bloom count. It should just be the sort of the total number of days in a year that from 2002 to 2020 that's been seen in this region. So you could definitely see this is like a hotspot of algal bloom, if you wish. And then if you want to look at the trends, you can see most of the area, you see increases with small exceptions. So it's very dynamic, very interesting, even though the mean chlorophyll concentration is seeing a small, tiny little decrease. So to summarize, so this very simple request by our mayor really led to this very sort of, if you really want to look into the details, we have very little information. What you can see to the right is the paper that was published by Wang et al. In 2021, basically highlighting in the coastal seas of China, it's receiving huge amount of inputs, Yellow River, Yangtze River, and the Pearl River, this high input of dissolving organic nitrogen and silicate, as well as phosphorus. So obviously, these are the drivers of what we see today. And we also know nitrogen and phosphorus reduction will take decades. And already from the Pearl River Delta, from the limited observation by Hong Kong Department of Environmental Protection, we know the biology, the community of the algal species are evolving. And also, as we, obviously with that, the hypoxia, spatial extent and timing will evolve. So it's really important. So we start to think about what should we manage. Obviously, we want to reduce nitrogen phosphorus reduction, but more immediately, we have this human health fishery as well as biodiversity concerns. So which lead me to the second part of the talk is we are very much struggling with what's the relevant scale that we can study, and then also to basically try to solve the problem. So I wanted to, I'm sure you're all aware of this great paper by Garrett Harding, Tragedy of the Commons, that appeared 1960 something in Science. So essentially, and fast forward, and in a lot of my work, when we are dealing with organisms who cannot speak for themselves, it's enormously important to have their rights represented somehow in our sort of all the management frame, also environmental ethics. So if you bear that in mind, I wanted to draw your attention to this little beach area, which is on the top of the Mears Bay, which has a tiny little watershed with a reservoir on top, and then a little river stream, and then a nice beach. And you can see it's very developed with currently a subway. station is being constructed and a wastewater treatment plant. And this is a seaside resort. I will digress just for 2 slides. One of the other side of this investigation is we started to also look at carbon dioxide budget in this area. Jimmy Zhao's work has already shown there is flux of CO2 from the air to the sea. That unit is in meters square, moles per meter square per year. So if you convert it to seconds to compare with some of our recent flux chamber measurement that was made last week. So we can see our measurements is actually an order of magnitude greater, and most likely is because of the subway construction is adding a lot of alkalinity directly to the river. We can see the R ratio, which a way to measure with a way to tell how much alkaline, the opposite of the acidity, is in the water. And typically rivers would be very close to 1. And in our case, it's much greater than 1. It's even sometimes close to 2. So by bringing these alkaline into the coastal sea would enhance the ability of the ocean to suck up CO2. And this is another very hot topic. There are a lot of people looking into marine carbon direct removal, and alkalinity enhancement is one of the proposed ways. So we obviously will continue to track that. So, but coming back to algal, so, and I'm really talking from the land perspective or the land ocean continuum perspective. So we started to really probe into this wastewater treatment plants. We sampled the influent as well as the effluent after the sort of industrial traditional wastewater treatment. And then it goes through this sort of a settling pond or wetland, and then it goes to the river. And then we also, in addition to sample the water and the estuary, the mixed brackish water, we also sampling groundwater along the beach, because they're basically both are bringing fluxes, if you wish to think that way, to the sea. So one of the things that are one of the biggest concerns of harmful algal bloom, this is a report by FAO and IAEA published in 2023. I'll come back to that. Is basically one of the drivers to have early warning or forecasting for harmful algal bloom are these toxins. So we measured, we started to collect sample every month since April this year, and we found basically 5 shellfish toxins, and this one doesn't seem to be locally produced from the species we looked at, and it still has to come from a little bit offshore. So we still trying to figure out which organisms is producing which algal toxin, and there is still no agreed upon maximum contaminant level for these toxins in seawater, but there are food standards. So we are working very closely with Shenzhen CDC to look at essentially the propagation of all of these toxins also in seafood. So that's what we are looking at. And we also are interested in applying a lot of this environmental DNA tools. And this is the work done by a research assistant professor, Alex Palomo, in my group. He comes to this team with a wastewater treatment and also drinking water treatment background. So therefore, we started to look into both the antibiotic resistant genes and pathogens. So very quickly, When we sampled 4 times in the last couple of years in a small little watershed, as expected, there are a lot of removal of human pathogens such as Salmonella, which is this brown one. Once you take raw sewage through the wastewater treatment plant. But when we looked at some certain pathogens, we found, in particular, E. coli, this Enterococci, and particularly this Vibrio species, they seems to be very persistent, even though their relative abundance as other pathogens, as they go to sea, we know saline solutions tend to be able to kill stuff, but their species tend to adapt and don't seem to go away. And I should point out, these species are also the same ones that are of interest by NOAA's ecological forecasting for the Chesapeake Bay and also Gulf of Mexico. So we definitely see this connection in our tiny little watershed. And coming presumably from the sewage. And then when we looked into antibiotic resistant genes, WHO is very interested in these ARGs because when they spread in the environment, they would make antibiotic resistant superbugs, which then we will have no treatment. And when you are infected with these, they are fatal. So wastewater treatment plant is a known hotspot of ARGs. So, and actually, but quantification of ARGs has been very difficult until recently. Also, environmental microbiologist Professor Tong Zheng and his group at Hong Kong University has published this paper only last year to sort of have a means of comparing all the ARG data across different environments. So we are very pleased to see the sewage values that they report globally for the sewage data points they found are very similar, and our sewage is a little bit higher than that. And also the seawater and the groundwater we collected at the beach are very similar. And our seawater actually has slightly more ARG copies per cell. So with that, so we are happy with the quality of our data. So when we looked into our system, you can see the ARG copy of cell obviously the highest in the sewage. When you treat it, it's becoming a lot lower. But in the environment, we still see these ARG copies. And if you blow up the groundwater, the lowest abundance ARG copies, 2 types of water, groundwater and seawater, you will see that the compositions of these ARGs are actually very similar, further demonstrating that these wastewaters are spreading ARGs from terrestrial environment to our coastal water. And then if we look at some of the details, so basically this is the raw sewage, a lot of ARGs, and then you have the treated wastewater, which comes down quite a bit. But surprisingly, a lot of the river water has quite higher copies of ARG, and also you see them also even in the estuary and seawater. And the reason for that is because in many of these coastal communities, even when you build wastewater treatment plant, not all sewage is collected and goes through the wastewater treatment plant, particularly when you have big rainstorms, the sewer will overflow and raw sewage will directly enter the river and enter the sea. And that's what we see precisely here. And that's really, really bad. And it's really, really why you must close your beaches when you have a storm. So this sort of exacerbates. So when you have climate change, more storm, is going to be really challenging to manage this problem. And then just a few more interesting findings. Alex being a really good bioinformatics, we also looked at where these genes are located. We find for certain types of them, they are on the plasmid. The significance of this is that when the genes are on the plasmid, they can horizontally transfer, meaning it can go from one bacteria onto the next one. So this is how ARGs can spread further into different kinds of bacteria. And then if they evolve and become pathogenic, then it's all bad news for us. And just a little bit, and you can clearly see there are a lot of nitrate in the effluent, and it gets a little bit diluted when it enters the sea, but it's still 5 milligram per liter. And the sort of the standard, at least the Chinese government one, is not to have this more than 1.5. So here we have exceedance of at least 3 times higher. So one of the goals of the project is try to quantify everything. So even with the kind of, we need so much data, we needed to think about whether it makes sense to stick to something small like this or do the whole Pearl River Delta. So we begin to take already existing models that's established for Pearl River Delta by my colleague, Professor Tian. And we built a model for this little watershed. And what we see preliminarily, we only recently instrumented this river with water level and some groundwater wells. We will calibrate this better. But right now you can see the surface water discharge pretty much responds to the precipitation. And then the groundwater discharge is somewhat modulated and it converges to, so basically these hills are all hard rocks. The sort of the sand and alluvium aquifer is the dark blue part where all the flow lines converge. And hopefully we will have integrated model that we can model both fresh and groundwater discharge of nutrients into this our little embayment and try to develop biogeochemical models and eventually maybe early warning. So that model was taken from a much bigger Pearl River estuary, surface water and groundwater coupled model. But as you can see, even here, Hong Kong is excluded and Macau. So this clearly doesn't make any sense. So, and now clearly, ideally, the integrated model should include the sea. And so this is already the problem because you can see from Professor Gan's work from earlier, their model boundary is essentially the land and our model boundary is essentially the seashore. So there is absolutely no coupling between the two. And I think that really needs to happen. And following the line of the wastewater treatment, we have a lot of people in the Pearl River Delta region. Lots of wastewater gets treated. Yet this is a modeling result. It's a data model, machine learning model. And what's really disturbing is when you have wastewater treatment, you should really see a sort of like line without these seasonalities. The seasonality tells you the sewer lines are not tight. Whenever you have rainfall, groundwater level rising, they leak, they dilute the sewage. We're basically have a big problem with combined sewer overflow in this whole region. As a result, when we combined all the historical data of the nitrogen, both inorganic, organic nitrogen for summer and winter, you can see this two big, very large dots of big source of this nitrogen input to this region. So no wonder you see the algal blooms and also coastal hypoxia. So I don't know, I think I should have time, just a few words on biodiversity. So DNA is, again, this is work by Alex. So we also took transects. So this is from another much bigger wastewater treatment plants discharging to the sea, a transect of samples. And then this is a small embayment. And then this is a sort of what we call open site. We used 3 different primer sets to look at prokaryotes. I will not talk about that. Eukaryotes, which is now we're talking about algae and maybe some other protozoan sort of organisms, and also a little bit about vertebrates, which mostly fish. And you can see when you look at the eukaryotic communities, the January, you have the least amount of richness and diversity. So December, January samples tend to be on this side, and July and August. So basically, our they are sort of 2 different kinds of communities of organisms. And for example, copepods a very high abundance in January, but they actually are there throughout. And there are different strains of copepods. One thing about biology, as a chemist, I find biology really baffling. There are just so many different species, and some of this algal, they are the same species, but only this strain has the toxin. So they just want to, they're very difficult to study. And then we have the green algae. If you can see that it's quite prominent in January, but it is also there in December a lot, although we did see a little bit of that in July. And then diatoms are only a little bit in January. So they're primarily July, August species, and these other kinds of diatoms also low in January, but quite high in July. And this Zoodonatia, which is a diatom known to produce neurotoxin domoic acid, which causes a lot of problem in Pacific Northwest. Not quite there in January, but they are there in July and August. And we did detect earlier on in our samples every time this acid. So it's definitely in our system. And some of the vertebrates, again, I don't know any fish, particularly the Latin name, but they're different from the places geographically and also surface and bottom, a lot of seasonality. It's amazing we still have, or at least this is what the DNA says. So all of this is interesting. It's from the molecular perspective, and it would be really cool to be able to work with real biologists who actually work with these species. So in summary, in this region, we have untreated and treated sewage and supply massive amount of nitrogen and phosphorus to the estuary, and similar problems you see everywhere. But I think from a small sort of a watershed to a small embayment, we can clearly see the spread of human pathogens, the connection between land to sea, and some of these ARGs. And there is, of course, the concern of algal toxins. I always come to environmental problem with this idea that we needed to solve the problem. So the solution has to come from addressing the sewer overflow and treatment of sewage. Now, the following part are just a little bit more philosophical, if you wish. I just want to ponder on 3 points. So the blooms are obviously happening, we should make note of them on every day because we tend to manage our life, maybe even hourly. But this is the from satellite remote sensing, on the days without clouds, you can see the currents and they obviously extremely dynamic. But it's very rare that we have neutron fluxes reconstructed on the daily resolution. So this paper that my colleague Eden and we co-supervised a student, we try to develop a machine learning model to reconstruct, estimate dissolved inorganic nitrogen daily fluxes. We are somewhat successful. We trained the model from 7 watersheds, and we are able to split a watershed in China, half and half, and then get reasonable results. And we are currently working on this in the Pearl River Delta area. So once we have this, we would very much look forward to working with oceanographers like Professor Gann's group and so on to have a more integrated land and ocean continuum model. And the second thing is this wonderful paper written by Ho and McCulloch. They are from Stanford, and they use Lake Erie, which is one of the most well-studied freshwater system with lots of tracks of monitoring, to make the point that we don't really know a lot about the time course of each single harmful algal bloom events. There are a lot of discrepancy about whether it was even a bloom event. If you just look at their compilation of data from 95 to 2011, or how big was the bloom, the area extent, a lot of ambiguity there again, as well as about the timing. This one is the most confusing. We don't know when it starts. Perhaps we know better about when it peaks, but we also don't know fully when it ends. This is very unsatisfying, because if you wanted to predict or forecast, are you going to forecast just onset or the peak or the area? It's not really clear. And then Isley and Pomadi of AWAD, this is another great aquatic science center in Switzerland. They wrote this paper and basically said, look, we can pretty much, based on the time course of the bloom event, this is more broadly speaking, phytoplankton, not just for harmful algal, but I assume they are very similar. You have to understand the whole plankton bloom to understand harmful algal bloom. So at least according to them, there are these 5 different types with different degrees of difficulty of characterizing their time course, let alone to make the prediction. So I, in particular, enjoyed reading this document was in a book put together by NIH many years ago by Joanne Burkholder. I think she's a real biologist. So she wasn't happy it's even called algal bloom, because actually a lot of these things are heterotrophs, or really animals. They're not algae. They don't photosynthesize. And again, like more than 20 years later, we still struggle with the factors that control how bloom develop and then dissipate, as you have just seen. And that's in the lake system. That's much better studied. So here, Burkholder articulates we needed to have better culture in order to understand particularly these toxic strains, because the ones we cultivate in the lab may not be the particular strain, and we make them tame by keeping them in nice cultures. Anyways, she has a lot to say about that. Fortunately, the second point, the gene-specific probes are really helpful, as you have seen today from the eDNA work. But the toxin probes, not so much. Maybe some progress, but not as much as we would have liked. And we still struggle the whole human health food web questions. So still today, we are reactive instead of proactive in management of harmful algal bloom. And this is the same in my neck of the sea. I showed you how Pearl River Delta, Shenzhen, Hong Kong coast water and the little embayment. And I want to draw your attention to the biggest water conference in the world that happened last World Water Day, 2023. One of the proud achievements of this was they collected over 800 commitments by various government and agencies that manage water. When I searched for harmful algal bloom, it returned 0 result. It doesn't mean no one cares about it. I did find this one entry. I didn't look carefully about them all. So basically, there's a clear divide between freshwater management goals and coastal water management goals. This is highlighted even at the highest level. So for this, I must refer to a paper Hans Pearl and colleagues been writing about the freshwater to marine continuum. And one of his greatest contribution was in freshwater bloom management. People always thought, well, goes back to David Schindler's work that the experimental lake in Canadian lakes, when you reduce phosphorus, you cut down the cyanobacteria and blue-green algae, blah, blah, blah. But later on, we now find both nitrogen and phosphorus inputs need to be managed. So this is sort of synchronizes both the freshwater and marine water in terms of pollution reduction. Those are the two primary pollutants we need to manage for both type of aquatic system. And I was lucky enough to sit right next to Jacob Granit, who was with the Stockholm Environment Institute and now runs the Swedish Aid Agency for Development. And he was also worked for World Bank and many of the other things. So there was this UN document. I didn't even know there was this fancy panel called a Scientific and Technical Advisory Panel for Global Environment Facility. They had this conceptual framework for governance. So basically talking about that you need to solve this problem by managing land pollutants. And interestingly, Sweden, I think this is the only country which now they have an agency for marine and water management. So they're integrated. I'm not aware any other place that has this, but even they struggle. So yes, I think we will continue to struggle, and I will be talking about how to incorporate some of the nature-based solution for nitrogen and phosphorus removal on Thursday. So I think that's the key to solve this problem. We cannot continue to continue to have this tragedy of the common. And this is my final slide. I think it will be helpful for this harmful algal bloom community to establish a framework, exactly what the early warning should be on, and what should we be forecasting on, and is it from the expert? How are we going to do stakeholder consultation? This 200-ish page documents has a statement. Maybe we can learn from the weather science people. But I think they also laid out a roadmap on how to do this. And it'll be interesting to maybe do a technology readiness level assessment of various countries and around the world. But basically, I think this problem is pretty big than any country, but it doesn't seem to get the real attention it deserves. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Ian. That's wonderful. Trying to put my clapping hands up. Yeah, lots of food for thought, and I will open it for questions.
Well, there are only 4 of us, so
Yes, just jump in.
And thank you so much for the talk. Really, really interesting work. Um, I did have a couple of questions. So one thing about the early warning system,
Mhm.
there was an early warning system in place. What management actions could people actually take? So it's always a question with forecasting. It's like, well, what could you do with the forecasts if you had them? And I'm not sure what can be done if we knew an algal bloom is coming, what sorts of things could be done?
Yeah, that's really excellent. The motivation was very practical, right? The mayor wanted to have better water quality. And what can be done? Um, so what we're doing is right now they're doing something really simple and stupid. They just have these drones out with cameras and then look. And then if it looks really bad and then they also have I think the shore-based work is underutilized. You could definitely see, you have weather forecasts. We know when you have at least in our area, when you have these big storm event, you just close the beach. Doesn't matter, because the chances of having human pathogens on them are so high, you just don't want to take your chance. You know what I mean? Sort of
Yeah. Okay.
side things.
Yeah. So I guess, yeah, that's kind of like my question was, is it just like a reactive thing, like you would close the beaches because you know the blooms are coming, or is there something that you can do knowing that the blooms are coming that you can actually forestall them? Like you do something like, I don't know, switch off the sewage pumping or something for a day to avoid the algal blooms? Or is it really just focused on let's not let people go in the water?
Unfortunately, I think that's really the only thing you can do because there's no storage capacity to store any
Yeah.
of the sewage. Yeah. So, and we're talking about you saw that map. It's a massive amount of water getting processed. So, so, so we just have to live with our consequences, unfortunately, of having so many people living so close to the coast. And I don't know what to tell you. I mean, there is this actually very interesting I don't know if it's plus side. So one of the algal bloom species is this whatever they call Nautica syntica. I mean, it gives a fluorescence. It's very beautiful, but it is a it's a nuisance bloom. But they become a tourist attraction now.
Yeah.
So so, I don't know. It's a very complicated relationship between these coastal community and their seas. So then, I think I'm thinking out loud. I think the CDC is becoming increasingly interested in our work because I think people are getting poisoned. So if anything, my hunches are we are probably going to direct more of our work into understanding the toxins, where they come from, and how they propagate in the food web, and what we might be able to do in terms of the aquaculture practice to try to, maybe we have something more we can do to, to reduce the poisoning.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's I don't know whether it'll become that way, but I think it's worth trying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Cool. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Can I have a second question, Xiao Xiao?
Yeah, go ahead, Belinda.
So I really liked the slide about the different types of predictability. Because that was the next question that I was going to ask you, is how predictable you thought these systems were. So I wonder, like, where do you think that this system sits in the predictability space? Is it how predictable is it versus how chaotic is it? What do you think?
Ah, that's this. Yeah, I mean, I think that would be the holy grail, isn't it? But I'm very simple-minded. I'm thinking if I can get the daily nutrient fluxes somewhat to, to a degree of within the comfort zone of big uncertainty. And then it really depends on what we want to predict, right? Because I think right now we don't really know. Are we trying to predict the onset or how big the plume is? I don't think we can ever get to the individual species. That would be too much. I don't think I mean, that would be probably highly unpredictable. So,
Yeah, speaking as a biologist, I'm guessing that's never going to be predictable.
yes, I know. So, but I think maybe we can try to predict the biomass or chlorophyll, maybe dissolved oxygen. Those are maybe someday within my lifetime possible. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, but it'll take still many generations of work. I think the key is right now, I don't want to say anything bad about remote sensing people, but I feel having their technology so much more ahead of what other sort of in situ measurement, the time series can do. It's sort of it's good and bad. Maybe we become over reliant on that. Uh, you know, because they have the prettiest picture at very high resolution. But I don't know. I like to see more real in situ data. And you never know. And I think these individual species, particular toxic strains, are still really deserve our attention. And I'm sort of on that one. I'm with Joanne Burkholder. I think we kind of still in the dark age.
Yeah. Thanks, Belinda. Ian, maybe I can make a comment from what I read. So I'm not a biologist, so I'm way going out of my comfort zone. But I think what NOAA's forecasting system does is that they are not trying to predict when the algal bloom will happen, but it's more like a monitoring. And then so my understanding is they are relying on remote sensing. And if they see big signal of chlorophyll, I think they also develop some algorithm to try to tease out if it's just a normal chlorophyll or it's a harmful algal bloom with some kind of different channels and backscatter and all that. But my understanding is they use that information, and if they see that there is some signal, they send people out actually collect samples, and so their warning system is more about giving a few days warning. So if they see a bloom, then they immediately take measurement and they try to predict how much it will bloom in the next couple of days, and they make warnings to the beachgoers and the stakeholders to say, here's our prediction. But I don't think at this moment, anybody can predict when algal bloom will happen. But I think it still has value, right? If you can monitor it real time and you can give warning to people, that might be good enough. But do we have such a system in China or in Australia? That I think if we can have this system, then that's already a big advancement in dealing with the problem.
Yeah, I agree, but I don't think we have yeah, this is why I ended with this, we wanted to really establish this framework, right? What do we mean by this early warning and exactly what we can and cannot do? And and I think what NOAA does, I mean, we sort of did that but maybe not so fancy. With the, in the Shenzhen coastal water, we also look at the remote sensing, and then we try to alert the governments, and then they fly their drones, and then they take some water, check what's in the water. I think that's highly practical, particularly in these. I didn't come with this. Sybil Sissinger has this big paper on the global nutrient fluxes from various rivers and even smaller rivers, not just these big ones. And I think what needs to happen is we needed to have the land people and the ocean people really look at these almost like a risk map, if you know what I mean. You can start with a more connected risk mapping of these things. But my concern, and the model is still useful, is because you can influence how, let's say, Africa is going to develop. Is it going to just the same thing is going to happen? Like if you look at China, every coastal sea is now having bloom problem. Do we want to do that? And maybe there's a better path for just coming at this, like what the Swedish people are articulating in that governance framework. So, and I don't see this at all in the sort of the water management. Because your coastal water is so dependent on what the water management agencies on land will do. So maybe that's what I see that's missing. And having the two scientific discipline also disconnected is not very helpful, because the land model stops at the shore and the sea model.
That's an excellent point. I think you will get a lot of people will resonate with that message for the CSIO Environment Research Unit, because that's the whole point.
Yeah, the whole CSIRO you integrated. Maybe you're the only place that has the hope. We'll have a coupled land and ocean model.
Yes, you need to mention that on Thursday.
Yes, I'll mention it on the next talk. Because I really think it's a unique place to be. Like the Swedish, they have to manage marine and the water together now, and and then they would need their science support, and then all the science are not there.
I think from the Australian perspective, there's certainly a lot of interest in connecting land and sea through the coast.